Presentation 1.3. In this video, we will begin to address the question of how we are going to actually go about studying sexuality in this class. You might have gotten the idea from watching videos 1.1 and 1.2 that we are going to spend a lot of time studying our experience. If you did, then you are on the right track. But this raises the immediate problem of individual perception. How do we know if our perception is correct? After all, people rarely perceive the same thing in the same way. So how do we know whose perception is right? Human perception is variable. It always comes from a perspective, and it is always a matter of interpretation. This is a serious problem that scientists and scholars have literally spent centuries thinking about. For our purposes, we're not going to debate whose perception is right or wrong. If you interpret your experience one way, but a classmate interprets it differently, we will not sort through those differences as if we can prove whose interpretation is correct. Rather, we ask each of us to examine how we came to perceive and interpret our experience in the way we did. Rather than debate the correctness of a perception or interpretation, we simply start with the fact of perception and recognize that perception is part of experience. In fact, we could say that to perceive something is to experience it. Our goal is to examine perception and experience without enforcing preset judgments about what is correct or how things should be. In this class, we will not be using a social science approach. This is because a social science approach is inadequate for our purposes. The social science approach solves the problem of perception by trying to control the variability of human perception. It creates concepts that can be observed and tested. It tries to create results that can be replicated by others. It tries to remove the individual scientist from the equation of science. And it does all of this because it presumes that there is a stable and true reality that not only exists separately from the human world, but can also be known as it exists separately from the human world. This is a very big presumption. In this class, we will be using a human science approach. This approach does not try to remove the fact of the variability of human perception from the formal process of science. It presumes that even if a stable and true reality exists separately from humans, the only access we have to it is through our contact with it. In this way, we take the fact of human perception directly into account in our scientific study of communicative sexualities. How exactly are we going to do this? Well, it's pretty simple, really. We study our lived experience, that is, experience as we lived it. We begin our study of sexuality by looking directly at our own experience, not because we are experts about some universal truth related to sexuality, but simply because it is our only direct access to it. This last point is very, very important. Our experience, if we start with ideas, that is, with presumptions about what sexuality is, then we will tend to see only what we have presumed. It is very important that we work hard to set aside our presumptions and describe our experience as we experienced it. This leads to one of the most important points in the scientific study of communicative sexualities. Our presuppositions must be continuously examined. There is much that we all take for granted about the world that functions outside of our conscious awareness as we go through the routines of everyday life. This is the level at which culture works. Culture provides us with ready-made understandings. It provides us with so-called common sense, and it tells us what makes sense and what doesn't. It doesn't make sense for U.S. Americans, for example, to greet one another by bowing, or for men to greet each other by kissing each other on both sides of the cheeks. When we greet someone, we simply know to shake hands or slap the shoulder or use some other hand gesture that's become a common and taken for granted greeting among our peers. The first and most important step in our research in this class is learning how to come to see our presuppositions as they are at work, forming our perception and thus also our experience. Here's another important point for us to consider. Who decides what counts as legitimate knowledge? This is important because, at least in our culture, we tend to privilege so-called objective knowledge and dismiss individual experience as only anecdotal. Experience is often presumed to be unreliable evidence and therefore cannot be a basis for legitimate knowledge. We think this because we tend to believe in a universal truth and a universal reality that exists separately from the human world. This is a deeply taken for granted presumption that, in our culture, is taken as the basis for scientific knowledge. So, the bottom line here is that we must work against our cultural presumptions and value our own experience enough to look at it very closely, to ask ourselves to be precise observers of our experience, and to be dedicated to recognizing the presuppositions that are at work in our experience. So, there you have it. We've covered a lot of important points in this short video, but these are points that will be with us as we move through virtually every aspect of this course. Our next discussion board number 3, deals directly with issues discussed in this video. I suggest that you go to that discussion board right now, as these ideas are still fresh in your mind.